When it comes to the age of the human race, there are two diametrically opposed theories. The most commonly accepted is that of the evolutionists, who believe that modern man evolved between 225,000 and 2 million years ago. On the other side of the fence are the creationists, who believe that God created the heavens, the earth, and man somewhere in the time frame of 6,000 to 50,000 years ago. Christians also believe that all humans are descendants of Adam and Eve. Which one of these viewpoints has the latest DNA evidence on its side? You'd be surprised.
The nucleus of a human cell contains 99.5% of our DNA. That is, tiny strands of coded information that codes for the structure and function of the human body. Half of that DNA comes from an individual's mother and the other half from the father. But because both halves are shuffled together, it's difficult to identify which parent contributed which element. Mitochondrial DNA is different. It's found outside the nucleus of the cell, where there are hundreds of little energy-producing components called mitochondria. Each of these mitochondria contains a circular strand of DNA that's contributed exclusively by the mother. Because mitochondrial DNA remains relatively unchanged, it can be used to trace a person's lineage back for thousands of years, and perhaps even to the beginning of time. The uproar about mitochondrial DNA really began back in 1987 when a study was conducted by researchers at UC Berkeley which compared the mitochondrial DNA of 147 people from 5 of the world's geographic locations. Based on the results of the study, researchers concluded that all of the 147 people had the same female ancestor, an individual that's become known as the mitochondrial Eve.
Do these findings actually prove the biblical story of Adam and Eve? Or is there another explanation, one that's more in line with the theory of evolution?
The mitochondrial DNA evidence can mean one of two things. In the beginning, there really was one set of parents, which would mean that mitochondrial Eve could be the biblical Eve, or all modern humans are descended from a very small population of humans that existed at one time. Evolutionists theorize that the original group of humans contained more than one woman, so it had several sources for mitochondrial DNA. However, the DNA for all but one of the sources became extinct when subsequent generations failed to produce any female offspring. Therefore, the mitochondrial Eve is simply the one and only female of the original population whose offspring have provided a continuous supply of female descendants. The mitochondrial Eve evidence does not force the belief that there was only one woman from whom we all descended, but, and this is very important, it is most definitely consistent with it. And of course, this is something that evolutionists never expected they'd have to deal with. So in order to explain away the possibility of the biblical Eve, they've had to come up with a very far-fetched explanation about mitochondrial Eve. Their explanation is that her family somehow spread across the globe and replaced all the other archaic humans, who just happened to have failed in their efforts to produce human female offspring. Now that's pretty hard to swallow.
The news that mitochondrial DNA might prove the existence, or at least the possibility, of the biblical Eve sent shockwaves through the scientific community. How could all humans be descended from one individual if our species was supposedly evolving all over the world? But there was another fact to deal with. Mitochondrial DNA evidence was about to reveal the time frame in which this common ancestor lived. Would this piece of information support the prevailing scientific wisdom, or deal it another blow?
Evolutionists were very aware of the way in which the mitochondrial Eve discovery could have been seen to have vindicated the Bible, so they countered this supposition with proof that the mitochondrial Eve lived far too long ago to be the biblical Eve. This belief was based on something called a molecular clock. The molecular clock theory proposes that mutations in the mitochondrial DNA of humans occur at a certain rate, and when we compare the genetic material of various groups of people who are alive today, we find certain differences in the genetic code that result from those mutations. By rewinding the genetic clock, scientists came up with an estimated rate of mutation and thus were able to calculate the supposed age of mitochondrial Eve. The first surprise that evolutionists got from the molecular clock was that Eve existed approximately 250,000 years ago. Evolutionists have been saying for years that our common ancestor was an ape-like creature who lived some 3.5 million years ago. And in their view, it required millions of years for our supposed evolutionary ancestors to evolve into humans. But there's this molecular clock which they devised, telling them that this all happened in a time frame of just 250,000 years. In effect, the molecular clock threw the evolutionary clock out the window.
Faced with what seemed to be an impossible date for the origin of mankind, researchers went back to the lab to determine if any mistakes had been made. Perhaps a miscalculation had thrown off their molecular clock. But would a recalibration lead them to dates that would support the theory of evolution, or would it push them even closer to the biblical time frame?
Scientists who felt that the molecular clock dates for mitochondrial Eve were out of line were in for an even bigger surprise in 1998. New discoveries were made which indicate that mutations in mitochondrial DNA occur even more rapidly than previously thought. In fact, the latest DNA research shows that mutations occur 20 times faster than the original estimate. That means that the mitochondrial Eve lived between 6,000 and 6,500 years ago.
This shocking DNA evidence would seem to cast doubt on Darwin's theory of evolution.